Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. I'm looking forward to talking a bit about immigration. I never thought I was someone who needed no introduction, but apparently the organizers of the conference felt I needed no introduction. So I am introducing myself. And anyone who wants to know anything about me can look in the program or Google me or whatever. I'm going to not waste time on that because I got a lot of other stuff I wanted to do. Look, I got interested. Immigration was not always the place where I spent most of my time, more on economic policy and things related to that. But I got quite interested in immigration for a number of reasons, one of which is the fact, let me just figure out how I do this. This one, right? I can't see the slides. That's the only problem. Oh, I see them down there. There we go. I got interested in immigration because immigration has become probably the most polarizing issue in American history. Gallup said it was the most polarizing in the last 25 years, with a gap of view of 40 points between Republicans and Democrats. And you can see here how I've split out the two and shown that the 48% of Republicans see immigration as the top issue in America, whereas a much smaller percentage of independents and Democrats. And so immigration is both a highly partisan issue and, for most of this year, was the most important issue that Americans cited in this election, which is very unusual. It's almost always the economy, things like that. It did slip to number two, the first becoming something along the lines of the future of democracy. But immigration is definitely front of mind. So I decided I wanted to learn a bunch about immigration. One of the first things I noticed is something very unusual, which is, or at least seemed unusual to me, which is that the relationship between where people live and how they feel about immigrants is not what you would expect. If you look at the 10 states with the highest share of immigrant population, 8 of them are blue states and are therefore more positive toward immigration. If you look at the 10 states with the smallest percentage of immigrants, 9 of them are red states and therefore see the least of immigrants. So the people who see the least of immigrants are the most opposed to having immigrants, and the people who see the most of immigrants in their daily lives are the ones that are most comfortable about having immigrants. So that's an interesting phenomenon. So I decided to delve into this. My wife, who's right there ready to correct me as soon as I make a mistake, has spent her life on refugee and humanitarian issues, which obviously bear heavily on immigrants. And so I've heard a lot about it around the dinner table and have found it interesting. So I decided I wanted to learn about it. And what I learned is that immigration is complicated. This is a chart showing our immigration system. I'm not going to take your time to go through it all, but it's all there. So we decided, my wife and I decided to do a joint project, an op-ed and graphic for the New York Times. It does bring with it significant marital strains, but we did get to a happy place, which is this. And so I'm not going to go through this chart, but I will go through a lot of the components of it in a minute, and you'll see how it works. But this was sort of what we came up with in terms of really trying to understand what was going on with immigration, and particularly at the southern border. The main point is the system is broken. You can see all those different things moving around. There's no logic to most of it, and the system clearly needs to be changed. I don't know how much folks here know about immigration, so I'm going to start with some basics that I learned a lot, and hopefully you will learn some things too about what it is we're really talking about here. So if you want to talk about it, wait a minute, how did I get here? Yes, this is where I want to be. If you want to talk about it in terms of the overall picture of people coming into America, there are several different buckets of people who come into America. The smallest bucket on the left are people who get green cards. Some people think of them as work permits, but they're really permanent residents. They allow people, not yet citizens, to stay here permanently. Then we have a whole bunch of temporary visas, people who come on student visas, people who come for certain job classifications that they qualify, and so on and so forth. And then the stuff that's in red and orange and so on is the famous southern border. And the fact is we did have about 3.25 million people cross altogether the southern border in the past fiscal year, and I'm going to talk a lot more about that. And so when you net all this out, in 2022 to include, because a lot of people go back, 2022 to 2023, we took in about 2.5 million people who were not born here through all these various mechanisms. And that 2.5 million number you could keep in mind because it is kind of relevant. So let's talk a little bit about history. I think everybody studied in grade school the great waves of immigration that occurred here back in 1850 when a lot of Irish people came here, including many of my wife's forebears, around the turn of the 20th century when 4 of my grandparents came here from Eastern Europe. But then in reaction to that, and this is a little bit like what we're experiencing today, in reaction to that, we closed the door in 1924 with the Johnson-Reed Act, and essentially you can see the way immigration dropped all the way down to the bottom. And this, among many other things, of course, had an effect. Everyone is, I'm sure, aware of the issue around World War II and taking refugees, especially Jewish refugees, and our failure to take very many. You can thank Johnson-Reed and a lot of the isolationism that went with it for that. But in 1965, we had another immigration bill that was much more open and much more designed to bring in particularly family members of people who are living here and people who could perform useful services here, much more employment-based immigration. But the result of that shouldn't come as a surprise because as we know, the waves of immigration in the late 19th century produced an America that was roughly at its peak, about 15% foreign-born. Immigration Act of 1924 took it down all the way to 5%. And then when we liberalized it, it went right back up to where it is today. So again, in terms of historical parallels, you had that very strong reaction to what happened in the early 20th century, and you are having, at least among some people, a strong reaction to what is happening today. It is important to note that we are living in an age of migration. It is not just the U.S. with our 15 or 16% of of people born elsewhere. You can look at Sweden at 20%, Germany at 19%. There's been migration all over the world, not just from South America to the U.S., African and Syria refugees to Europe, migrant workers in Asia, often from India. We have a posse arriving. And then in Europe, we established the Schengen zone, which allowed Europeans to move along freely and led to a lot of internal migration within Europe. And that has produced its own backlash. I'm sure you've been following the recent European Parliament elections and the triumph or the strong performance by the right wing, particularly in France and in Germany. And clearly there is discontent or concern or whatever you want to call it in many quarters about immigration. Can I just interrupt because who's ever in charge of this, my clock is not counting down, so I have absolutely no idea of how much more time. I mean, I would just talk all afternoon if the clock doesn't start to tell me where I am. There we go. Okay, thank you very much. All right, so let's turn to the question of why is immigration important? Immigration is important for a lot of reasons. It certainly brings us our diversity and some of the specialness that is America. But there's a big demographic reason why, especially at this point in history, we should want more immigration. If you look at the chart, let's just start on the chart at the right, actually. That's China. So China's population has peaked right about now. And on present course and speed, their population will go down to under 800 million by the turn of the century. Why is that? It is because the Chinese fertility rate is down about 1.2, even though the one-child policy is long gone. For a whole variety of reasons, the Chinese are not having a lot of kids. And about 300,000 Chinese a year leave. So actually, they're losing population in that sense. And virtually nobody immigrates into China. It's a very monocultural society, not very welcoming to immigrants. If you look at the left side, this is the U.S. If we took in no immigrants, our population would also peak now. It wouldn't go down quite as rapidly as China's because we have a slightly higher fertility rate, but it would go down. If we take in 1 million a year, which was roughly our average before COVID of immigrants, our population would flatten out, and eventually it would start to go down a little bit, but it would remain static. In order to achieve a population growth rate that's the same as what we had in the 20 years leading up to 2020, we would need to take in 3 million immigrants a year, unless fertility changes or some other dramatic thing happens. And so simply to maintain a reasonable growth in population, we need immigration. Why do we need immigration? In addition to the absolute numbers, we are an aging society. As you can see here, this year the number of people above 55 passed the number of people under 25 for the first time. In 2025, the 55 pluses will pass the 25 to 54-year-olds, which are considered prime age working population. And this creates more burden on our social services, Medicare, Social Security, things of the like, the smaller the percentage of the population that's actually working. You can see a little bit right now, we're obviously still in a somewhat odd period kind of post-COVID, but we are in a position right now where it's not that we have too many workers, it's that we don't have enough workers. These are just some headlines we pulled out, but I see them all the time of employers who are looking for workers, who are looking for workers. And I can show it to you another way here, which is if you look at our labor force going back to 2008, the dark blue at the bottom are native-borns, the light blue at the top are foreign-borns. You can see in the early 2000s, we did have more workers than we had jobs, but that has flipped around. And you can see that more clearly on the right side of the chart, that there, as we sit here today, 2 million more jobs, 2 million more jobs than there are workers. So the immigrant workforce, and people worry a lot again about immigrants taking away American jobs. The immigrant workforce is roughly 19% foreign-born, roughly similar to that I showed you the percentage of total foreign-born people in America. But if you look over on the right, what is maybe not appreciated is that of that 19%, half of it, roughly 10%, are naturalized citizens. 5% are legal non-citizens, meaning they have green cards, and 4% are undocumented. So for all the talk about undocumented workers and illegal workers and this and that, they are only 4% are undocumented. The other thing to recognize is how big a role foreign-born workers play in many parts of our economy. Foreign-born workers are 30% of our construction workers. They're 20% are business and professional services, 20% in leisure and hospitality, 20% in agriculture, 20% in transportation, and just about 20% in manufacturing. So foreign-born workers play a critical role in our economy functioning as well as it does. So now let's turn to the question. I showed you before the different categories of immigrants or non-US born people here. Let's talk about how they are getting here. And let's start with the famous southern border, about which we have all read so much. The first thing to recognize about the southern border is that the colors that are not red are all people who crossed the border and ended up in the custody of US authorities. These are not people who got across the border, snuck over, disappeared, became undocumented workers, off the payroll, this and that. I mean, also, no Social Security numbers, all that kind of stuff. That's not what we're talking about here. These are people who were apprehended. I'll show you in a minute what happens to them, or we call them encounters in the lexicon, but they are in the system. It is not like we have a completely open border where people can just wander in. The wandering in part of it, which is called gotaways in immigration lexicon, is the red. And what you can see is that if you go back to the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, the red was a huge percentage. We kind of did have an open border. All those red people in red, just came across the border, disappeared into our system, and are now people that we're talking about trying to figure out what to do with, whether we document them, don't document them. Biden just had a proposal and so forth. But they are people who came here outside of our system. We have gotten that number down to a very small number. And it's not to say we shouldn't have a secure border, but you have to put this in perspective that these large numbers of people do come here and are in our custody, so to speak. Who are they? You know, you read a little bit about people coming from Africa and China and all this stuff. That's still a trivial number. The vast, vast preponderance of people crossing that border are coming from Latin America and South America, Mexico being the biggest at around 30%, but Venezuela, Guatemala, Honduras, Cuba, all those other places counting for a lot as well. One of the things which is a little hard to see on this chart, but I'll mention it, is that one of the things that has been accomplished recently is that there are really kind of two ways to get here. One is to go through a port of entry, and we have a bunch of official ports of entry, just like if you fly into an airport and there's customs. We have ports of entry along the southern border, and some people come through that, and others decide just to cross on their own. They're still apprehended, they're still encountered, they still go in the system, but they're crossing outside of a port of entry. Those people, we have shifted through some policies that President Biden put in place. We have shifted more of the people to coming through ports of entry, which is a good thing. It's just more orderly and comports better with a sound system. So why are they coming here? A few different reasons. One reason why they're coming here in such large numbers has to do with COVID. Latin America suffered much more during COVID than we did for a variety of reasons. For one thing, Latin America is heavily dependent on tourism. There was no tourism during COVID. They did much more in the way of lockdowns than we did, which had a negative effect on their economy. As you can see on the upper left, this is real GDP change between 2019 and 2020. We're the blue bar, third from the right, and you can see almost everybody is to the left of us, and some very, very substantial numbers. And then on the right, you can see that, of course, not surprisingly, their GDP per capita is much lower than ours as well. And so they had a lot of lockdowns. They didn't have the fiscal room to do as much as we did in terms of stimulus, so their economies were hurt quite badly, which gave people a reason to leave. I think it has to be said that President Biden did play a bit of a role early on in some of this. It is absolutely important to note that apprehensions were climbing in 2020, even before Biden was elected. But he did say some things during the campaign and after, which I think in honesty could be read as encouragement to people to come here, about deportations, about building border wall, and so on and so forth. He did suspend both for at least a time. And so for that reason, but also really just the advent of social media, the word kind of got out that you could come to America. And so a lot of folks did. And a lot of folks did, particularly from places like Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, the Northern Triangle that you've heard so much about. There was a lot of smuggling and so forth. So that's the situation at the southern border. Let me move on from that and talk about another piece of this. These are green cards. As I mentioned, green cards are permanent residency. You can work, you don't have to work, but they allow you to stay here short of becoming a citizen. They are people who, the lighter color, the light purple color, are people who are already here and are simply, they got here on some other kind of visa legally, and then over time they applied for a green card and they eventually got it. The darker color are new arrivals, and I mention this specifically because when you look across all this, you can see that we're only issuing about 400,000 green cards a year. That is the same number as we issued in 1990, even though our population is up 32% since then. And so we have really done nothing to reform our green card process in order to recognize the fact that this is a bigger country with more needs. You can see it also in that chart on the right, world population 44, us 32, green cards 4. So within the green card world, there are several kinds of green cards. And one of the things I think that people who want to reform our immigration policies are very focused on is the idea of rationalizing the issuance of green cards and trying to have them go more to people who can contribute economically, have skills in this country. But as we sit here today, 58% of them are family-based. So this is somebody, family that has a parent or a child or something that they want to bring here. And there's obviously a humanitarian aspect to that, but that's a big percentage of it. And so, so let me just turn the page here. Sorry. Yeah. So these are the family visas that we give out that way, and you can see, it's my right page. You can see that at the moment, for immediate family members, you can get a green card reasonably easily. For more distant family members, you go into a system where the number they give out every year is capped at 166,000. There are now 7 million backlog of people trying to get this, and so there's a 43-year wait to get one, approximately. There are, if you like that fact, there are 1.3 million people in the U.S. trying to bring siblings from Mexico, and we only give out 5,600 of those a year, so that would take 232 years to clear out that backlog. If you're in the Philippines, it would take 63 years to clear out your backlog, and so this is all in the spirit of the system being broken. We also do take in, on a humanitarian basis, refugees. And look, refugees are a tough issue. We all know the stories, as I mentioned earlier, about World War II, and our failure to take in enough refugees led to a lot of people who literally were murdered, as well as other things. But on the other hand, obviously, we can't take in every refugee from every part of the world, because if you look at the red line on this chart, this is the number of displaced persons worldwide, I guess a pool of potential refugees. And not surprisingly, if you follow the news and all that, you can see that it's risen from 20 million to 120 million. If you look at the blue line on the left, and that's in millions, let's just emphasize that one, those are millions. If you look on the left side of the chart, let me emphasize those are thousands, so 1/1000th of a million. And and the number of humanitarian refugee visas that we have issued dropped steadily from 1992 all the way down to 2020. It's come up a bit under President Biden, but we are still issuing 60,000 of these a year against 120 million displaced persons worldwide. And these are people who come from places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Afghanistan, Myanmar, Guatemala, I mean, places where people truly are in peril of their lives. I would also add just one historical footnote. In 1980, when there was another Refugee Act passed, and the U.S. took in 200,000 people from Vietnam and Cambodia, the famous boat people under President Reagan. And so we have a history of welcoming at least a reasonable number of people, and we're not in any way fulfilling that obligation at the moment. So let's talk about asylum seekers. So people who cross the southern border, and I'm going to come back to them in a minute, and are encountered, often go into the asylum program. People have a right under international law to seek asylum under certain circumstances. This group on this page are people who did not come through the southern border. They came sort of what I'll call the front door through the normal process. But it's really meant to just illustrate to you again how few asylum seekers we're taking. We had 50,000 applications in 2024, and we took roughly half of them, so that's 25,000. Not a lot. There are all kinds of legal requirements for getting asylum in terms of having credible fears of persecution, and things like that. I'm not going to get into all the details on that because it gets really complicated and will get beyond my area of expertise. But it is a real problem. One of the things that was in the bill, that was a bipartisan bill that some of you have noticed, that was agreed to by Republicans and Democrats in the Senate, James Lankford, Michael Bennet, and then it went to the House, and then Donald Trump torpedoed it because he didn't want to give the Democrats something to run on. He wanted to be able to continue to say that they had failed on the border. That would have reformed a lot of this process and at least created more judges, more of an ability to deal with the backlog, and which I will going to show you right here. So if you look at asylum seekers, you can see that the asylum seeker backlog is now 4 million a year. If you are in the asylum process in New York, the court dates are backlogged to 2033. If you are there, the average case takes 3 years and 4 months. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I'm waiting for somebody to tell me I'm wrong about something. So, yeah, I know. You'll get your moment of glory. But right now I'm up here and you're down there. Let's just remember that. So in any event, there's the asylum process, and it is a very legalistic process. It exists under the 1951 treaty about who qualifies and who doesn't, is completely backlogged. And by the way, only about half of the people who go through the process actually end up qualifying. So then I'm ticking through this pie chart of different ways that people get green cards. So let's talk about employment-based green cards. So this is in a way the holy grail of what we're trying to accomplish, which is to bring in more people who can work here and in jobs where we need people to work inside of them. The problem is that 27% is a bit illusory, because roughly half of it are families of workers who are already here, and family of workers, new arrivals. Some of them will work, but there's no effort to match skills with who we actually take in. They're coming in on the basis of being the spouse of someone. And so when you get done with all that, only 13% of all of these green cards, only 13% of all these green cards go to workers themselves, directly to the workers who have been judged to have skills that are in need here. And so you can see here again that sorry, get to my right page. You can see here again that we have a cap on the bottom of 140,000 of employment-based green cards that we give out every year. We now have a backlog of 1.8 million people who are trying to get one. And so the processing time on average, if you're an employer and you want to sponsor somebody for a green card and everything is by the book, right skills, right everything, guy doesn't have a criminal record or person or lady, it still takes on average 3.2 years to process through our system. Another category, which I won't spend a lot of time on, but again, just to give you a full picture of who's coming here, are temporary visas. And this is everything from students, certain kinds of special work visas like H-1Bs, people who have exceptional skill, things like that. But again, like the H-1Bs that everybody feels are important to filling out our workforce with skills that are needed, we only issue 85,000 H-1Bs per year. All right, so obviously, if you go all the way back to where I started and all the emotion around this, some of the feeling about immigrants and so on is certainly cultural and social, but some of it is economic. There has been a narrative or a theme for many years that immigrants take U.S. jobs, depress U.S. wages, and so on. This has been studied. As ad nauseum by economists. This is a small sampling of all the economic studies that have been done, and I'm not going to try to walk through this, but obviously, negative numbers are bad, positive numbers are good, but these numbers are all really small. And what these numbers are efforts to study what was the effect on domestic workers of non-Americans, immigrants, whatever you want to call them, coming here and going to work. And the answer is really small. I would also importantly note, all these studies were done before COVID, before this current issue of a shortage of workers, not an abundance of workers. And so I think making the case that workers are taking American jobs, as I said before, the number of open jobs that we have is a really hard case to make. You can even make a case they help because they create economic activity, makes the economy stronger, creates more jobs for everyone. If you read the New York Post, you would think that every immigrant murders somebody every 12 or 14 hours. That is not what is going on. In fact, what is really interesting here is that illegal immigrants commit crimes at a lower rate than U.S.-born, and undocumented immigrants commit crimes at an even lower rate than that. Not totally shocking, especially if you're undocumented. Committing a crime, you're going to get sent back to wherever you came from, and so you really don't want to do that. And so immigrants have proven to be really good citizens. They are really good citizens also in terms of their attainments. So this chart is basically meant to show you what the educational attainments are of immigrants versus non-immigrants by age, so that you can as statisticians say, you can control for age and just look at the same age. So what do you find? Not surprisingly, you find that immigrants generally have a slightly lower educational attainment when they come here. They're coming here, as my grandparents never went to college. They couldn't afford to, they had to work. And so that's not totally shocking. What's maybe more surprising is that the children of immigrants actually have a higher degree of of higher education attainment than native-born Americans. The children of immigrants get master's degrees at a rate 30% higher than natives. And immigrants themselves have master's degrees at higher rates. And what's also kind of interesting is that when you get to the grandchildren of immigrants, they actually perform more like Native Americans. So they kind of slip back, if you will, a little bit as you get to the third generation. And you can look at incomes, and you basically are going to see the same picture. Immigrants come, whoops, go back. Immigrants come here and they don't qualify for the highest paid jobs, so they take the jobs they can get and they do them. Their children become very well educated relative to natives, and they can take better jobs, earn higher incomes than native-born Americans, and you end up, and then in the third generation, they kind of become part of our overall society and perform more or less on average. And as I said earlier, immigrants have a huge share of the labor force in all kinds of industries, from construction, leisure, hospitality. They play a role at every level of our society, at every level of our commercial world. 15 of the 40 biggest companies in America have CEOs who are not born here, which is pretty incredible. And you can even look at something like Amazon, where Jeff Bezos' father was not born here. It's one generation later, but certainly wouldn't be here if his father hadn't gotten into the country. And so it's an extraordinary record of success. It's also worth, well, this goes back a ways in history, but if you go back far enough, you'll find there are all kinds of companies in the U.S., JP Morgan, AT&T, Boeing, they were all founded by immigrants back in the day. So the immigration issue is not going away. It's not going away in part because there is a high desire on the part of people around the world. This is a Gallup survey. High desire on part of people all around the world to migrate, and you can see that simply increase. The U.S. is not on here. They weren't surveyed exactly, but I would note in the case of the U.S. that we have probably 60 million-ish non-native born people living in America. There are 3 million Americans who don't live in America. And so Americans seem to be happy here, and it does feel like we are still the place around the world that everybody wants to come. So what should we do? As I alluded earlier, the issues become ridiculously polarized. Everybody's in their corners. Everybody's taking extreme positions. We had this brief moment when we had this bipartisan agreement that, as I said, Donald Trump decided was not in his political interests, and so he killed it. And so we're kind of back at square one. The Biden administration has been doing some things to try to secure the border. Some of them may not stand up under court tests. There's certainly a lot of emotion around those decisions, but we have to do it. So what do we need to do? As I hope I convinced you, even if you didn't get into all the weeds and the numbers and the this and the that, I hope I convinced you that the immigration system is just broken, that the way we go about approving visas, who we take, who we don't take, makes no sense and really needs just a full overhaul. It needs to be funded. Part of why this is all taking so long is because the government has not provided the right funding. Every time we have a funding fight on Capitol Hill, agencies like this seem to end up on the short end of the stick. We need to speed up these decisions. The idea that someone can cross the southern border, claim asylum, receive what's called a notice to appear, go into the immigration system, ask for amnesty, and be in the country for 3 or 4 years waiting to find out and able to work seems to me to not be the way to run a railroad. And I think, and as I said, and lastly, as I said, I do think, no matter what you think about the issue, I'd like to think everybody agrees that we should have secure borders, that every country should be able to decide who comes here and who doesn't come here. I'm going to close with a picture of these two guys. The guy on the left may be familiar to some or all of you. He was born in Taiwan in 1963. He came here at the age of 9 and was sent to live with an uncle. He worked his way through high school in a Denny's. He went to Oregon State University and then got a degree in electrical engineering from Stanford. And at the age of 30, in 1993, he decided to start his own company. So he went with his would-be partners. He went back to Denny's for, I guess, symbolic reasons, and they agreed to start a company. And that company today is NVIDIA, the most valuable company in the world. The guy on the right was born in Turkey. He is 5 years older. He came to the U.S. when Turkey was going through various forms of political turmoil. He had a very distinguished educational career here, got his PhD at MIT, and got into a highly, highly theoretical aspect of physics, electrical engineering, whatever you want to call it, but it was a development that turned out to be critical to going from 4G to 5G. But it was so obscure and so theoretical that he couldn't find anybody in the US to sponsor him to stay here, so he went back to Turkey. And eventually he got connected to Huawei, which is the big Chinese telecoms company, and he essentially went to work with them, gave them his technology, and Huawei today, which is one of our biggest worries from a cybersecurity and a privacy and all that kind of stuff point of view, Huawei today makes roughly 1/3 of the 5G equipment around the world because this guy couldn't stay in America and ended up in China. So thank you all for listening. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Dr. Pamela Denise Long. I am a 7th-generation American descendant of U.S. slaves. I grew up in Mississippi, no running water, nor Indo plumbing. We never owned a car growing up. My daughter and the generation of my siblings is the first-generation Americans for us who didn't have legalized laws that prevented us from doing the thing. So I'm also first-generation college. So I listened to these stories and the expectation that we should accommodate everyone who wants to come into America, hundreds of millions of people. And I'm thinking to myself, why would I support more competition for me, more competition for the 50 million descendants of U.S. slaves, many of whom are in the same position I am, first generation college, whatever. So at what point do we decide as Americans it is not our role to accommodate everyone who chooses to migrate to a first world nation, and why should we replace ourselves every generation? Maybe we should focus on the issues that cause multi-generational Americans to underperform people who are hungry to come here in the first place.
That's a very, very fair question. Number one, I do not support, as I hope I made clear, the idea that anybody wants to come here can come here. I think we have to have a thoughtful, balanced policy of who we want to have come here. I think number two, the chart I showed you about the demographics and what will happen to our population if we don't take in any immigrants, I think is very undesirable in terms of the pressures it's going to put on our budget, just with a smaller number of working people paying smaller amounts of taxes, supporting a larger number of older people. I think a reasonable goal for our demographic policy should be to have our population, at the very, very, very least, stay stable, and I think in an ideal world continue to grow at a historic rate. As I said, staying stable requires 1 million immigrants a year. going up at its historic rate requires 3 million immigrants a year. I think they should be picked heavily. I mean, I certainly want family reunification and things like that, but I think they should be picked heavily based on the skills they can contribute to our economy. And as I said, I think that if you pick, like these two guys I showed you, at least the one who stayed here, if you pick the right people, they can create unbelievable opportunity for other people without necessarily displacing Americans for jobs. And at the moment, as I said, we have more jobs than we have people to fill them. If we were in a different environment, like the early 90s, let's say, when we had more people than we had jobs, you could maybe have a different conversation. But right now, we need people to do this stuff. And I don't think it doesn't cost us anything to take them. So it actually adds to us because they come here legally, they pay taxes and add to the economy. And I personally don't think it gets in the way of a lot of the other things we need to do for people who've been here for a long time, things that we should be doing.
Hi, my name is Sid Wilson. I'm the president and CEO of the Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility. I want to ask the question from a different standpoint. I, too, am a black man. I'm a black Latino. I'm Dominican American. And knowing that there are more blacks in Latin America than there are in the US, I want to make sure that I make clear of the diversity, the racial diversity within Latin America and how we all came here. But my question is that when you look at the Japanese economy, the South Korean economies, and others who have had such strict immigration, and you look at the fact that the Nikkei, I think, finally hit its all-time average for the first time in 40 years, when the Dow was only like at 3,000. How can we maybe do a better job of sharing the fact that immigration is a positive? What we saw during the Trump administration's immigration crackdown, you saw that those jobs that we thought were going to be taken by Americans were never taken by Americans. And it forced retailers and hotels and others to create cost-push inflation. So when we think about the reason that we have for inflation, I argue is because of the fact that companies had no choice because there were no immigrants to take those opportunities, and they had to jack up prices, and thus all of us had to pay for that. But how do you think is a better way to share the fact that that immigration is a strong, positive aspect of America, not to mention the fact that the demographics, the age demographics, favor having more immigrants, because the reality is that the birth rate is not the same for others, and we have to look at immigration.
That's a great question. Look, the challenge, as I said at the beginning, is that, as Gallup said, they have not found a more polarizing issue in 25 years. The extremeness of each set of views is so remarkable that how you bring people together at all, I don't know. Look, I think we all know that if we had not taken in immigrants, if we just kind of shut the door in, 1820 or something like that, this would be a very different country in terms of, I saw a lot of people here who seemed to kind of raise their hands as immigrants. We would not be the country we are. And part of the challenges that Japan is facing at the moment, where finally the Nikkei, yes, did get back, but it took it 40 years, is the fact that they have no immigration and they just don't welcome we welcome people with all kinds of different skills and so forth. And in a better world, I could imagine there are lots of NGOs at this conference who are good at this sort of thing. I could imagine a kind of a public campaign to try to explain to people the benefits of diversity, the benefits of immigration, the benefits of bringing people from other places. But when you've got the other side pounding away every day at 2.6 million people crossing the border and leaving people with the impression that they're wandering around the country murdering little children, it's really hard to have that conversation. But I think that's the conversation we need to have. All right, go ahead.
So reluctantly,
but brief remarks.
Reluctantly, by and large, this was very good. Actually, I have to commend you. Yeah, I was surprised how good it was. But anyway, I just want to add just a couple of corrections because you did mention 120 million refugees. That number, 120 million, refers to displaced people.
I said that.
Pardon?
I said displaced people.
Yeah, but you said displaced people. Only 40 million of them are refugees.
Okay,
Most
fine.
of them are internally displaced within their own countries and have no intention of leaving, or if they do leave, it's to a neighboring country. Only 40 million refugees. We have a global population of 8 billion. These are 40 million people who have identifiable reasons to have to leave their country. So I think with 8 billion people globally, we ought to be able to find room for 40 million. Just the other question about sharing and the responsibility, that is one of the great problems that we face because a very small number of developed countries take in most of these displaced people. 86% of refugees live in countries that are less developed. So the overwhelming majority of refugees stay in poor countries near them. A very small percentage want to or get to the developed world. And the last correction I want to make is you refer to asylum law as international law. That it is international law. We were not signatories to the 1951 convention, but in international law, there's no enforcement mechanism, so you can obey it, you cannot obey it. But in 1980, we passed an immigration law that Congress passed, which took the very language of the 1951 convention into our federal laws. And that convention says that anybody fleeing persecution who comes to a country's border has a right to have their asylum case heard. So of these 40 million people who want to, if not all going to come here, but if they come to our border, we have to at least hear them. The biggest.
I think your time has expired, as they say. Well, I want to be able to respond to this.
I know, but one last thing about asylum.
Always people want to ask questions.
All right, I give up.
All right. Well, look. Number one. I gave you this presentation yesterday to read it and tell me there was anything wrong, but you decided to wait and tell all of them what the stuff that was wrong. Number two, I don't personally think in any world of reality that we're going to take in 40 million refugees. Okay.
Your colleagues.
Okay.
The reason we are the third largest population in the United States of America, instead of the second, the founding black population has endured all the things that everybody else gets to come here and enjoy. We are still a disfavored population for even our multi-generational white Americans. We're third largest because of immigration. That matters, because let me tell you, I've had people tell me and my advocates to my face, you can't get anything done without us. So unless you support mass immigration, you can forget it. Literally had someone tell me that not even a month ago in a public dialogue. It costs us something. And I would challenge my white Americans who haven't had to endure the things that we have had to endure to stop and listen to us and say they don't take anything from you, but you should inquire with us as to what our experience is.
Fair enough. All right, this lady right there. I think I'm out of time. Do I have another minute or two, or what do you guys want to do? 2 minutes?
So quickly, since you've worked in administrations, and if we can't really count on Congress right this minute, what is the power that, for example, either states or the president can do to actually make, and I know that President Biden continues to put things out, but I don't know whether or not he really has the authority to do that. I know there's some question about that. So I'm just curious about the mechanics of what actually, who is it that can make some of these fixes?
Yeah, unfortunately, it is very limited, and we really need Congress. The states, it's being litigated because, Texas wanted to arrest these people. I think the states don't have a lot of power. The president has some wiggle room, I'll call it. If you take, and I don't want to get too far in the weeds, and I don't get my wife worked up again, but if you, like the 1951 Asylum Treaty has a standard of more likely than not they have to suffer from persecution. We have been giving asylum to people with lower standards than that. We can raise that standard a bit. There's some stuff around the edges that we can do. We can't solve the backlog problem because it needs money. Only Congress can appropriate money. And some of what Biden is trying to do now is of doubtful legal, doubtfully legal, and may get stopped. So the short answer is there's not a heck of a lot we can do without Congress coming to its senses.
Hi, my name is Evan. I'm a Bezos scholar. And my question is, do you think that President Trump's policy towards like the wall and the border has increased like stigma around immigration? And how would you...
I'm sorry, the president, which president?
Trump.
Trump's policies.
Former President Trump, sorry.
The other guy.
His policies
The other guy,
around like building the wall and everything around that. How do you think that's really contributed to the stigmatization of immigrants? And how would we go about fixing that? Because a lot of people think they are taking a lot of jobs, and you've clearly made that statement that it's a small percentage that are taking jobs, and most of the jobs that are quote unquote being taken are unskilled labor. So I would like your opinion on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Look, I think whatever you think about immigration, the idea, if you go back to when then candidate Trump ran the first time and he came down that escalator and he started talking about they were all rapists and murderers and a few good people. I think and I showed you the numbers, I think stigmatizing immigrants who are really coming here for a better life, the vast preponderance of them lead good lives, they get jobs. As I showed you, their children are more educated than Native American borns. We should be celebrating this. I mean, this is really a wonderful thing for our country that so many people want to come here. We just need to be more careful about how many, under what circumstances, and who. And so, yeah, I think we need to change. But it gets back to the question in the back. You know, it's just very hard. It's very hard when there's so much emotion around this issue to start to try to explain this stuff. I mean, people just don't want to listen, frankly. And as I said, you know, the polarization divide on this issue is so vast that getting people together to reach common ground is, I've never seen an issue this challenging. All right, very last question in the back.
Thank you. Yeah, I've always looked at that debate as a debate between xenophobia and economic policy, and I agree with you. I am, very quickly, naturalized U.S. citizen. I was here on an H-1B, student visas, green card. Is there, in terms of the complication of this debate, do you think that there can be at least some consensus on looking at, as you talked about, some of the employment type visas, increase on H-1Bs or green card, at least as a start, to get something done in immigration? We know, as you pointed out, H-1B visas are down to 65,000. They used to be at 195,000. They're way down. Is there any possibility, maybe not in an election year, but at least as a start to fixing an immigration system?
You know, I would love to end this on an optimistic note. I truly would, because that is obviously exactly what we should be doing to try to reform this. But again, it just doesn't, the ability just doesn't exist within the president's powers to do it. We do need congressional action. And it's, of course, exactly what we should be doing to make a start to try to give out more H-1Bs and especially skills-based. Look, it's an incredible thing. I'll end on this last sentence. It's an incredible thing in this country, and one of those two guys that I was talking about, the Turkish guy, exemplifies it, that you can come to this country, you can get educated, you can do extraordinarily well, and then you get sent back to where you came from. Thank you all very much.